Thank you, Dean and President, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. A very great pleasure because I've been following the career of the founder of the university, George Soros, for some time. Of course, he has a very interesting reputation in Great Britain as a result of certain financial maneuvers. But I'm glad that the end result of those financial maneuvers has led to the creation of an establishment such as this. And I wanted to come here very, very much because of the reputation of the university. It's done extraordinarily well since its foundation in the international league tables. Its Department of Politics and International Relations made 29th in the world in the QS rankings. That's pretty good considering there are something like 1,700 such departments in the world's universities. So very much a pleasure to come here to an intellectual city and to the new intellectual hub of an intellectual city. Wanted to talk tonight about refugees and wanted to talk about refugees in a sense of meditating on some of the principles that we should bear in mind when we talk about a very, very difficult subject. And I'm going to begin with a very, very simple proposition which will come back later on in the lecture. The very simple proposition is that how we treat others today, particularly those who are less fortunate than ourselves, particularly those who are excluded from the welfare of the world, how we treat those people today becomes something by which we justify ourselves in the future. That's the proposition that I wish to begin with. And of course, when I talk about justification, I'm automatically drawing a distinction between justification and justice. The two are not the same. You can justify yourself in any one of a number of ways, some good ways and some not so good ways. We're going to come to that. And when we talk about justice, there are different ways of approaching this question of justice. There's probably no such thing in human history, and certainly in no country on the earth right now, as a state which is perfectly just. Such a condition has eluded the human condition. There are efforts to create a just order, particularly within states and among states, but a just order necessarily, although it seeks inclusiveness, is not going to be able to benefit everybody on a completely equal basis. The whole nature of an ordered society is one, of course, which derives from inclusiveness, but order within that inclusiveness. And this means that not everyone is going to feel that they have been ordered in such a way that they are full beneficiaries of the justice that they think that they as an individual might deserve. So a just order is sometimes unjust, as far as members of the population might be concerned, although a just order in the absence of full justice might be the best that we're going to get. So I'll come back to all of those things as the lecture progresses. Let me just begin, as is my custom, and Dr. Large here from SOAS, the University of London, will understand that I begin almost all my lectures with stories. So let me begin with a story that relates to this particular picture here. You can see that at one point in time I was a very handsome young man. That's me at 3 months old. These are my parents. They were 18. They're dressed in their Sunday best. Those were the best clothes they had. That was the shed where we lived. And they were refugees in New Zealand. And they were just starting out on the long trek, the typical trek from rags to riches, and had a hard time of it. They were refugees from the war that broke out in China when Japan invaded China. And they were very fortunate to get on separate boats that managed to escape Hong Kong harbor just before it fell to the Japanese. And the family legend had it that these were New Zealand troop ships evacuating New Zealand soldiers. So the boats went to New Zealand, and the captain apparently said to them at the destination, "You better get out, there's nothing south of here but penguins." So they did get out and try to make a new life for themselves. And in due course, I came along and wondered what on earth I'd landed myself into. And that's the picture that is evident of all of that. But they were the boat people of their day. And it reminded me when just over a month ago, my wife and I were in Paris. And we came across certain of the contemporary attributes of Paris which were not exactly enlightening. We had found an apartment next to the apartment where Simone de Beauvoir, the famous philosopher, had lived. And we overlooked Montparnasse Cemetery, where she is buried with Jean-Paul Sartre, and where a great historical thinker called Raymond Aron is also buried. And it made me think back to 1979. In 1979, of course, you had a great crisis of refugees, and these were the Vietnamese boat people. And these people took to the seas in the usual flaky craft that weren't particularly seaworthy. Many of them drowned at sea, looking for some kind of respite, looking for some kind of refuge among the countries of the world. Some reached New Zealand, but you can imagine that's a pretty long sail all the way from Vietnam to New Zealand. But in the absence of any organized care from the international community, the philosophers of Paris convened a great conference. And to this conference came the very elderly Jean-Paul Sartre and the very, very elderly Raymond Aron. The two had quarreled decades before, and they couldn't even remember what it was they had quarreled over. But they reconciled at this conference, and their presence was enough to spark the intellectual community. And through the intellectual community, the government of France to accept more than 100,000 of the boat people into France, where they were settled and became members of society there. And it was regarded as a very great breakthrough in terms of organized compassion on the part of the public, albeit a very specialist part of the public, that was able to influence governments, and the government responded and accepted. In those days, there was a very large number, 100 to 120,000 of the boat people, and made them into citizens of France. I wanted to start from that because I want to look back to that moment when it was possible in that country to accept people, because the way they were treated then was very different to what we found in the streets of Paris today. We were greatly shocked walking around Paris to find encampments of Syrian refugees, and there would be entire families camped out by the great sites and monuments of Paris, mothers, fathers, and young children. And what was really quite heartbreaking about this was the reading of bedtime stories to the children just before they're going to tuck into their sleeping bags before going to sleep on the pavement in the very cold early spring of Paris. In other words, trying to keep up as normal a family life as possible underneath conditions in the public glare, and with no one that was prepared to make an organized effort to assist them. Obviously, there was individual charity from passers-by. Obviously, they had placed themselves in cunningly strategic positions to attract assistance from tourists, for instance, by Notre Dame and other great tourist locations. But it was very, very clear that they had no choice but to try to fabricate, simulate, impersonate a family life as refugees with no other cause, no other access to help. And the Paris of today is one which is very, very much marked, I think, by the contrast between what we see in the streets now and what was organized after some protest back in 1979 for the boat people of that particular period. I want to start the lecture proper by talking about the refugee crisis as it's affected Europe today. When 1 year ago Germany opened its doors for Syrian refugees and a huge exodus from that part of the world began to make its way to Europe. And it was a case, first of all, of getting to Europe, often on very, very leaky boats that made it to countries like Greece. There are all kinds of very touching photographs of Greek villagers swimming out to rescue children who had floundered at sea. There are even very, very touching and sentimental photographs of dolphins guiding the refugee boats to shore. And of course, once they got to shore, although they were treated very kindly by individual people and individual villages, the Greek government couldn't wait to get rid of them. And so apart from isolated instances, meeting points, congregation points, landing points like Lesbos, the Greek attitude, like the Italian attitude, is to process them as quickly as possible, give them exit visas, and hope they go somewhere else that could do something better with them. The majority wanted in any case to go on to something better, and particularly to go on to Germany, given the open doors that Germany at that brief moment in time was offering to the refugees. How to get there after they've made landfall in Greece and in other places? Well, this is where I think the contrast in Europe really does start to begin. Croatia opened up its frontiers to let them through. This was an act of great compassion. It was obviously not well thought through by the Social Democrat Prime Minister. He just announced that this was going to happen. They would be let through and they would be given safe transit to Austria and hopefully from there to Germany. It took about 2 days before he and his cabinet realized that logistically they were completely overrun. They absolutely had no capacity to handle the huge influx of refugees. So with compassion comes the question of logistics and the question of operational capacity. I want to come back to that. The Croatians and the Hungarians then began a very, very bitter argument, and I'm sure that all of you are very well aware of this. There was no love lost between the two prime ministers at that point in time, as the Hungarians accused the Croatians of playing fast and loose with the frontiers issue between the two countries, and therefore trying to intrude upon the sovereignty of the Hungarian government and the Hungarian people. I want to talk about all of that as well, and I want to talk about it in a way which fully recognizes that it's not just Hungary that may be in some way seen as being reluctant to help the refugees. My own country, Great Britain, has been less than helpful in this particular issue. It's been completely stingy on this particular issue. And it's very, very odd because in many, many ways, Great Britain is a very cosmopolitan country where the descendants of previous efforts at hospitality have been well received. We're going to have an election for the mayor of London later this week. The front runner, a member of the left, Sadiq Khan, should he win, and he probably will win, is going to be the first Islamic mayor of a big city in the southern part of England. He is going to be someone from an Asian background, therefore from a minority. And he is going to be somebody from a refugee family. And the acceptance of the voting public for a figure of that sort, because he promises to bring a program of municipal reform and good municipal administration, makes a contrast to the stinginess of the government itself when it came to confronting what shall we also do about the refugees. So I'm not just accusing one government in particular. This is something that very, very many countries in Europe have been derelict over. I'm going to suggest that this debate as to what we should do has not been without principles. But I do want to say at the very outset that we have functioned off an agenda of negative principles. So I want to go through what I think are these negative principles. And I think that you've got two major negative principles of the first order from which other principles derive. But as far as we can see, from our vantage point, away from Hungary, certainly in this country you've had two negative principles of the first order, the first being fear and resistance to the prospect of something new, something strange, in other words, something unquantifiable, something unpredictable, something enigmatic. And this is enigmatic in terms not only of cultural meaning, but in terms of the sheer numbers of people that might have been involved if they had passed through your territory. And then this was closely followed by another negative principle. And this was very, very much that this fear might also be the start of a loss. In other words, would Hungary lose something in admitting large numbers of people who were enigmatic, somehow unable to be ascertained at the outset, people who could not be immediately understood by Hungarian society. What would that mean in terms of a principle of loss? Would the foreigners steal part of the Hungarian identity away simply by their being here? And these two primary but negative principles gave rise to a whole raft of what I call principles of the third order, negative principles of the third order, in which much political capital was made of these first two principles of fear and feelings of loss, and turned into issues which were rhetorical, but which were deployed very, very much for political advantage and to justify the government's position that it did not want to have refugees on Hungarian soil. You had various tropes put forward that national sovereignty was at stake. It's our decision whether we let them in or not. We're not going to let Germany, Europe, or anyone else tell us what to do. The second was that it's also not just a question of sovereignty, it's also a question of territorial integrity. That's our land they want to cross. You know, what might they do to our land as they cross it? And I think the third negative principle, which was a politicized one, was very much, if they do come, if they do cross our land, if they do even temporarily occupy it, would this in any way detract from the grandeur, the historical greatness of Hungary? Once one of the great powers in Europe, would this somehow be a sullied image of these people who had nothing, were tramping across the soil of Hungary? And I think that for a variety of these negative principles and the power that they had, especially the element of fear, it was very, very hard for any kind of positive principles to intrude into the debate that were more powerful than the deployment of these negative principles. By contrast, the refugees also had principles. If you're a refugee and you're fleeing a war, particularly such a bitter war as had been taking place in Syria and continues to take place in Syria today, your first principle is to get out of there. And the first principle is to seek safety. And that's fully understandable. The second principle is to seek safety with guarantees. You know, you're not going to hazard everything for nothing. Germany offered that guarantee. Okay. And the third principle of the refugees was, okay, we're seeking safety. We would like to have safety with guarantees. And we would also like safety with guarantees and a sense of being in a location in which we can make a genuine new start. And so the reputation of Hungary, both as a cosmopolitan country with large migrant community, a country which was the richest country in Europe, was of course extremely attractive. So those three principles drove the refugees forwards. Principles opened up by the compassionate offer of Angela Merkel. But of course, to get there, the refugees had first of all to cross over large parts of Europe, including Hungary. And that's where their problems started. Of course, the question immediately arises, since they, for the most part, simply wanted to cross through Hungary rather than settle in Hungary, if their order of principles suggested that they wanted to get to Germany, where they could be received, where they could make a new start in life, what was the problem with letting them through? I think the Croatians realized this. They had great problems in terms of being able to handle logistically the influx of the refugees, food, water, medical care, laying on enough trucks, buses, trains, etc., etc. But if they were just passing through, these operational difficulties were things that could be perhaps handled, particularly in a much more organized country such as Hungary. So what I want to do now, having established these basic sort of ground considerations for what I think went on in this part of the world, talk about, well, what are we going to look at? We're going to look at more positive principles. Bearing in mind what I said at the very beginning, there's not going to be any such thing as a search for perfect justice in today's world. None of us benefits from perfect justice. We all feel offended from time to time because of an unjust situation. A student here at the university might feel that his or her professor marking his or her essay has been totally unjust in terms of giving a bad mark, for instance. It's impossible to have a uniform subjective agreement that you have everything within a realm of justice that benefits everybody. A just order, however, as I suggested earlier, is one which tries to make available the possibility and the opportunity of acquiring justice, of being able to have recourse to justice. Whether you get it or not, the opportunity is there. And the opportunity is there because a just order is one which is necessarily inclusive. No one's excluded from the possibility of trying to acquire justice, whether they get it or not. And I'm going to suggest that particularly in a Western European country, particularly one with a long Christian tradition, you can begin to construct the basic principles of a just order, one of inclusivity, by simply referring not only to the Christian teachings but to the Christological example. Two broad principles here which derive from the New Testament, both very much enunciated in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, and I'm very conscious of this since you put your visiting scholars in the Raoul Wallenberg house, which is just underneath the Matthias Church, and so the Gospel of St. Matthew, as we call the same, is very, very much germane to the discussions. But basically, the idea that an equality of treatment and expectation can derive from the principle of doing unto others as you would have them do to you. And we all know that statement. It actually exists in many, many different codes of ethics. There's even a version of a certain Buddhist ethic which is almost exactly the same in its expression. Now, in fact, this is not a principle to do with open-ended goodness. In fact, in many, many ways, it's an invocation to doing good, but it's also a very selfish principle because you would like to have good done to you in exactly the same way. In other words, the principle expects a return. Okay, so this basic principle of doing good unto others as you would have them do unto you is certainly open-reaching, but it's also self-seeking. And it's what they call mercy in the face of self-interest. And in fact, many of you will remember in the 1980s, many statesmen, led by Willy Brandt, who had been the former chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel's predecessor, convened underneath a banner called the Brandt Commission on North-South issues. In fact, their secretariat was next to my office on a daily basis. I was privy to the way they were constructing their final report. But it was a report calling for what they then described as a new international economic order based on self-interest. If the poor nations of the world could be helped to develop by a fairer international fiscal and particularly trading regime, then we ourselves would also benefit in the long run by having trading partners, for instance, who could buy more of our goods. This idea of goodness for the sake of one's own goodness is something which is both an outreach, but also something which is very much in one's own self-interest. So I think very, very much in terms of that, but think also of the good that has already been done to Hungarian refugees in the past. When I was a little bit older than that, I was working in Auckland, New Zealand, in the civil liberties chambers of various lawyers. That was one of the things I first wanted to be, a civil liberty lawyer. And one of the celebrated cases that we were involved with concerned a Hungarian refugee who'd made it to New Zealand. And this gentleman had become a criminal. In other words, he did not become a model citizen. He did not assimilate very well. He had become almost a model criminal in terms of the various subterfuges that he was engaged with to be deceitful and dishonest within society. And so the government threatened him with deportation, send him back to Hungary from whence he came. He's a no good member of society, he'll never assimilate properly, etc., etc. But his story was that he had fled Hungary in the first instance in 1956 after the Soviet tanks had rolled into the country. His story furthermore was that he was one of those on the streets fighting to resist the Soviet tanks, and that if he were returned forcibly to Hungary, then he would be persecuted, imprisoned, and possibly shot. Now, there was no way of proving that, It could have been completely an invented story. His character was such that it may well have been an invented story, but we thought there was a point of principle to defend here. And so my chambers undertook his defense. We made it into a very, very public case. We said that having issued hospitality, in fact, we were not entitled to revoke a hospitality that we ourselves had extended on the grounds of behavior after our offer of hospitality. And certainly we could not revoke our hospitality if it meant great detriment to the person from whom we were revoking the hospitality. All of this is contentious, of course, but we won our case. There was a lot of newspaper publicity. It made front page headline news. And it was a lesson very, very much in terms of, okay, sometimes you've got to exaggerate certain conditions in order to make a case stick in the public consciousness. At the same time, there were genuine principles involved, such as not only the extension of hospitality, but do you, as the person who extends hospitality, have the right to revoke it? And if you have the right to revoke it, under what conditions? In other words, under what conditions can you revoke your offer of inclusiveness? Okay, so we're back to the issue of inclusiveness. The second Christological principle I wanted to look at, which is germane to our contemplation of a just order, comes from again St. Matthew, and this is the parable of the sheep and the goats. You all know this particular parable. It's certainly my favorite in the Christian canon. It's the second coming. Christ has come back down to this level of the universe to judge the great and the good, and he divides them between the sheep and the goats. And what he says to both the sheep and the goats, the righteous and the unrighteous, whether they're going to be invited into heaven or sent to another place which is slightly warmer, then it was very, very much, welcome or not welcome because of what you did for people who were poor, who were starving, who were sick, who were in prison. And both sides said, well, look, we've never in any way tried to offend you. We've never seen you hungry or sick or in need of hospital care or in prison. And the reply of Christ in the second coming was, insofar as you did these things to the least of these, my brothers, then you also did it to me. Now, this is a very, very interesting principle, because what it depends upon is either Christ in an act of humility lowering himself to the level of the poorest, most destitute, most sickly, and probably the most criminal levels of society, people in prison. He lowers himself as he did in his first coming. Or in the second coming, he elevates all of these people to his level. And so they're raised up, as it were, to a level which is commensurate to the level of Christ himself. And this equality of inclusiveness, that those who are the most neglected, the most deprived, the most unfortunate of society, can be at that level with Christ in his sublime second presence, is something which I think is underappreciated as an essential and a basic Christological teaching in the Gospels of the Christian tradition. At some point in time, there's no longer any discrepancy. There's not only an absolute inclusiveness, but within that absolute inclusiveness, an absolute equality. And it seems to me that contemplation of something as radical as that, but which is as foundational as that to the Christian way of thinking, has eluded the debate here in Hungary when it comes to people who may be classified as refugees. I hasten to add that I'm not a Christian, but I've always found that particular passage to be very, very evocative indeed of something which I think is worthwhile contemplating. And finally, there's a certain political principle. You're part of Europe now, and for better or for worse. Obviously you want it to be for better. But Europe has been involved in one way or another in causing some of the problems in the Middle East in the first instance. You weren't part of that causation. You can blame the British and the French. They were very, very much to blame after World War I for some of the very grave difficulties that we face in the Middle East today. And again after World War II. You were not part of that, but Europe, I think, and you're part of Europe, has a shared responsibility to be cognizant at least of what has been caused and the difficulties that have been caused and to try to do something to ameliorate the difficulties caused by those divisions that Europe imposed upon that part of the world in the last century. There are various norms that we've been discussing. We've been discussing very high-level norms. Many of these norms are actually embedded in law, international law. International law, of course, is not enforceable. It's not one of these bodies of law that says, thou shalt do this, or there will be penalties. There's no sanction. You can get away with disobeying international law in many, many instances. There's only a quality of international agreement and international endorsement or international condemnation. But international law is flouted all the time. But Hungary is a signatory of the 1951 International Convention on Refugees. Hungary signed that in 1989. Now, there's a discrepancy here which I think all of you will be aware of, and that is international asylum law is not the same as international refugee law. If you claim asylum, then there are certain procedures that you must undertake. The state has certain rights. They can accept or reject asylum requests within certain procedural guidelines. There are European conventions on how these guidelines should be structured so that it's as transparent, as it were, request for asylum and the way it's handled. You cannot preemptorily reject an asylum claim, for instance. It has to be subject to a due process which is transparent and in which the person claiming can actually be represented in a legal sense. But the Convention on Refugees is something which, although not enforceable, and which allows a very, very great deal of interpretation on the part of the individual signatory states, nevertheless embodies a norm. And that norm is very, very much one of compassion, hospitality, reception, and inclusiveness, of which all nations who are signatories to this convention are meant to be in some way cognizant of. Even if you do not wish to be cognizant of these norms and of this particular convention, then of course one must be very, very conscious, as I said, of how others responded according to these norms to refugees from this country. The figures, of course, are very, very much still underneath contention. We don't actually know. But our estimates are that during the Soviet crackdown in 1956 in this country, some 250,000 Hungarians fled to other parts of the world, mostly to Europe. As I said, one managed to find his way all the way to New Zealand. Of that 250,000, some 30,000 went south to what was then Yugoslavia, and the others went to other parts of Europe, Germany, through Austria. In other words, following exactly the same route that today's refugees from Syria wish to undertake. So the idea of being able to benefit from international norms and international law while restraining oneself from offering the same benefits to others is something, I think, which acts against positive principles of a Christological sort, which I've tried to outline. Of course, there are operational difficulties, as I said. The Croatians encountered those within 2 days of their great act of compassion. The Germans have not so far encountered any great operational difficulties in absorbing the refugees. They had a plan in place. They were dispersed to different Länder, the different provinces or states of Germany. Municipalities were endowed with capacities to deal with the refugees in different locations. There were all kinds of scandals, of course, to do with gendered and sort of sexist behavior at festivals, but we don't actually know to what extent they were actually caused by refugee migrant people in any case. But by and large, Germany has done very, very well. But then that does raise the question, to what extent can only the great and the rich undertake compassion? If other countries are not big enough, rich enough, organized enough to do this kind of thing, can they be excused from the responsibility of having to do such things? Well, if one is to excuse oneself, that is one thing. Being able to deny somebody access to another country that does offer that kind of inclusivity, that's another thing entirely. So the question of reception and the question of throughput are raised here. Of course, Hungary is going through a period of what we call relative scarcity. It's extremely prosperous, believe it or not, compared with other parts of the world. I spent a lot of my time in Africa and the Middle East, and you guys are in paradise, whether you think it or not, despite the pauperization, of course, of various parts of the population, because of the advent of a more stringent neo-capitalist and neoliberal order. But there is a particular English novel which I read before coming here by Malcolm Bradbury. It's entitled Dr. Criminale. Dr. Criminale, of course, is aptly named. He's a Hungarian criminal, but an intellectual criminal, who in the novel is one of the world's greatest thinkers. So there's actually an English commentary here as much of envy as anything else, because we no longer have any great thinkers in our country. But the idea that great thinkers, particularly of cultural and social issues, expressed in a philosophical manner, should emanate from Hungary. Well, of course, that is something which is resonant in this particular novel by Malcolm Bradbury. And this particular novel talks about what life in Hungary once was. You could be assured of certain things if you were a citizen. You knew that your children could go to university. You knew that your children would not land you with bills for the rest of your life in terms of tuition fees for going to university. You knew that if you had cancer, you would have a hospital bed, that you'd get the best medical care on the public health system that it was possible at that moment in time for you to be able to receive. All of those things are called into question now. Medicine is expensive, best treatment is expensive, education is expensive. Even within the state universities, there's no absolute guarantee you're going to receive a high level of higher education without cost. So what the novel is about is the meltdown in the social environment as people come to terms with changed conditions, where things that were once plentiful are now scarce, and even though they're plentiful in terms of what others in other countries might enjoy, there's still a relative scarcity in terms of your own memory. You think back. This, of course, is something which is a condition of many countries. It's a condition, for instance, in France, where, as I said, we spent a month very, very recently. I've stayed in Paris on several occasions. I've been out to the banlieue, those areas that were shot up during the massacre, the Bataclan. I've been to those restaurants, waited for the Beaujolais to come in with the wine critic for what was then the International Herald Tribune at exactly one of the restaurants that was shot up by the attackers when Paris was hit by terrorism. So I know all of these areas very, very well. And there's a huge contrast, of course, in terms of French society and in terms of French elite society. So if you are going to receive people, if you are going to be inclusive of people, how then should this be done? This comes to a last set of principles which I think are self-explanatory. You see all the deprived people in the banlieue. People like Frantz Fanon was writing about this all those many years ago, back in the 1950s. He'd been a doctor in Marseille. He had to do work with the Arab populations, part of the migrant diaspora from North Africa in Marseille. He was able to talk to people who'd been brutalized by French society. And that kind of brutalization is still very, very much there. So you can be allowed in, but the ethos of inclusivity means that you must not only allow in, you must bring up to a certain level that is ascertainable by the bulk of French society. To a certain extent, the French have done this. One of the great wonders was looking at the cabinet list of the French government. It's really quite remarkable how many female ministers there are. It's quite remarkable how many minorities are in the French cabinet and how many minorities are in the ranks of the junior ministers. If you do a mathematical breakdown, the government is an exact depiction of society. The exact percentage of women, 50-50, okay? The exact depiction of this minority, this other minority. Backgrounds, latest minister, higher education, was a Moroccan shepherd girl who was a refugee. an Islamic minister, one of two. There were even at one point in time, but the latest one has just been fired, the culture minister, who were Asiatic. So it was the only cabinet in all of Europe where there were people who looked like me. And that certainly has not happened in Great Britain, for instance. I would like that to happen in Great Britain. And yet, what has happened when you look at the backgrounds of every single one of these representative minorities and of both genders is absolutely ferocious formation of the sort that in Great Britain we can't even imagine. To a certain extent, you can imagine it in American terms. You've been through Yale Law School, you've been through Harvard Business School, you've been formed in the Ivy League at a very, very austere but very, very elite level. But almost all of these ministers of all backgrounds in France had been through the École Nationale d'Administration. They were énarques, the most rigorous public administration finishing school on earth. They were all graduates of the Institut d'études politiques, sort of like their equivalent of the London School of Economics. They all had at least 2 master's degrees. They were all formed in such a rigorous way that it didn't matter what their background of diversity might have been. By the time they were finished going through all of this, they were all exactly the same. The French government takes no risks whatsoever with having a diverse cabinet and a body of ministers of this sort. Short of that straitjacketing of talent, because obviously these are talented people, they wouldn't have survived that system otherwise, but short of that kind of straitjacketing, short of that kind of forced uniformity, inclusiveness, of course, should demand and allow diversity. And I think that this is the real problem lying behind all of the principles that we've been discussing. What does this diversity mean, particularly when a certain form of diversity is brought into Europe from countries outside? I've talked about principles that derive from a Christological or a Christian view of the world. What about the introduction or the reinforcement of Islamic values in Europe today? And I think you don't have to wipe the slate very, very much before you find that the discourse devolves to one to do with Islam, what to do about Islam, and in particular a fear, as I said, this is your operative first principle, of what Islam wants to do to us. This poses a certain problems to do not only with opening up our borders, but opening up our minds, which in some ways is probably much more difficult than the simple opening up of a border, particularly if they're going to pass through. You open up your mind, some thoughts might not pass through, but stay. And I think this fear of change, this fear of having to become, let us say it works both ways. We hope our migrants become more European, and I think that the opposite end of the spectrum is that we become more Islamic. In other words, how cosmopolitan are we prepared to be within a Europe that was once extraordinarily cosmopolitan, which is now drawing barriers and lines and separation? In Great Britain, there's only really one Islamic intellectual, a gentleman called Tariq Ramadan, a very considerable intellectual figure, who is saying in very persuasive and in very moderated terms what this would mean for a Europe that then becomes more homogeneous in terms of these different ways of looking at the world, with values drawn from different sorts of thinking, different sources of thought, and different confessional inspirations. It's not a debate that has been willingly taken up by many people because of the huge difficulties and resistances that it evokes. But this may well be the heartland of what we must grapple with in terms of how open we want our principles and ourselves to be. Don't forget, Europe itself was once partly Islamic. Don't forget, when you're looking at the history of Europe, there really isn't a straight line from Greece to Rome to today. We really are not part of that Greco-Roman heritage. We went through all kinds of permutations, all kinds of transformations. Byzantine, for instance, the confrontation of Byzantium with other forces in world thought, Islamic thought, for instance, the conquest of half of Europe by the Mongol invaders and by others, including, of course, this part of Europe. Europe has never been something so set in its ways that it could not change in the past. So the question is, What do we do about the resistance to change here in the present? I've got no answers to these questions evoked by meditation on principles. I put it to you as an intellectual audience that it's our responsibility to meditate further and to think about possible responses to the problems raised by our contemplation of such principles. But I leave you once again with an image from Paris and an image from my family. I talked about this Hungarian dissident figure who purportedly fought on the streets of Budapest against the tanks and had become a criminal in New Zealand, a country which had given him refuge. Well, after we won the court case, then my father, who by that stage had become a prosperous businessman, gave him a job. I'm not sure whether this was part of the rehabilitation of this young man or whether it led my father into a long, slippery downhill slope. I think there was probably an exchange of values which did good perhaps, and perhaps some not good. But certainly, let's say that this particular gentleman who entered New Zealand as a refugee went on to a prosperous old age through one means or another. But when we were in Paris, seeing the spectacle of people who were deprived, there was a headline in the magazines. This is an article in particular to which I'm referring by a theological writer. His name was Henri Troinc. That's actually a Catholic name from west of France. It's not a Vietnamese name. And he basically headlined his article, Sartre, Aron, revenez. Jean-Paul Sartre, Raymond Aron, come back. In other words, come back from the generosity that you evoked on behalf of intellectual Paris that was able to have such an effect on political France back in 1979. Come back and do the same thing for us today, because there is something to this. When you affiliate yourself to your own history, when you have memory of your own history, and I said at the beginning I would come back to this. This is the end of the lecture. I'm now about to come back to it. And that is that when you have the memory of something that was once done, and in retrospect it was well done, it becomes a powerful memory and it becomes a benchmark. It justifies what you did back then. It also gives you a guideline as to what you can do now. Memory becomes that benchmark. Memory becomes that curious form of subjectively derived first principle. We did it once, so we could do it. We know from experience we can do it. Therefore, we should do it. And I think that memory adds an imperative to the norm. As I said, it affiliates ourselves in our own history and our own practice to that norm. It embeds us in a principle so it's no longer abstract. I think I want to say that in 2015, this country failed to create a memory for itself in the future. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.